Have you ever wondered what you would do if the child you spent your entire life protecting suddenly looked at you, as though you were nothing more than an inconvenience? Have you ever asked yourself whether the home filled with your happiest memories could one day become the very place where you felt like a stranger? And if that heartbreaking day ever came, would you quietly walk away, or would one forgotten piece of paper change everything? I never imagined I'd have to answer those questions myself. For over 40 years, I believed I had built more than just a house. I believed I had built a family. Every overtime shift, every missed vacation, and every sacrifice my wife and I made were for one simple dream: to give our son a better life than we ever had. I still remember carrying him through the front door of that house when he was just a little boy, laughing as his tiny hands reached for the walls that would watch him grow up. Birthdays were celebrated there. Christmas mornings echoed with excitement. The kitchen was filled with countless family dinners, endless conversations, and quiet promises that we would always be there for one another. Back then, I truly believed those walls would protect us forever. But life has a quiet way of changing people, often so gradually that you don't notice until the damage has already been done. After my wife passed away, the house felt different. The laughter disappeared first. Then came the silence. At first, I told myself my son was simply grieving in his own way. We all cope differently, don't we? I made excuse after excuse every time he skipped dinner with me, answered with nothing more than a few words, or avoided sitting in the living room where his mother and I had spent so many evenings together. I convinced myself that time would heal what loss had broken because the alternative was simply too painful to accept. Then his wife began making little comments that didn't seem important at first. She talked about changing rooms without asking me. She mentioned remodeling the house as though the decisions had already been made. Sometimes I'd come home from my morning walks to find furniture rearranged, or family photographs quietly taken down and replaced with decorations that made the house feel unfamiliar. I noticed every change, but I stayed silent. After all, I didn't want to become the difficult old man who complained about every little thing. Maybe this was simply what happened as children grew older and started building lives of their own. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. But deep inside, something didn't feel right. There was a distance growing between us that no amount of patience seemed able to close. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. It was an ordinary Tuesday. Sunlight streamed through the same windows my wife had loved, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, quietly looking through an old photo album. My son walked in, his expression colder than I'd ever seen before. There was no greeting, no smile, no small talk. He stood there for a few long seconds without saying a word, almost as if he had rehearsed what he was about to tell me. I looked up, expecting him to ask about dinner or maybe suggest we spend some time together. Instead, he looked me straight in the eyes and said the words that still echo in my mind every single day. "Dad, you don't belong in this house anymore." For a moment, I honestly thought I'd misheard him. Surely no son could say something like that to the man who had raised him. But what happened over the next few minutes proved those words were only the beginning, and neither my son nor his wife had the slightest idea that they had made one very dangerous assumption. I wish I could tell you those words came out of nowhere. I wish I could say my son woke up one morning and suddenly became someone I no longer recognize. But if I'm being honest, the signs had been there for months, maybe even years. I just refused to see them. Isn't that what parents often do? We overlook the little hurts because admitting them would mean accepting that something precious is slowly slipping away. I kept telling myself he was stressed from work, worried about bills, or simply trying to balance the responsibilities of raising a family. Every excuse I made protected him, but it also blinded me. Looking back now, I realize respect doesn't disappear overnight. It fades quietly, one small moment at a time. It started with conversations that suddenly stopped whenever I walked into the room. I'd step into the kitchen, and the laughter would vanish. My son and his wife would exchange quick glances before changing the subject. At first, I thought I was imagining it. After all, grief has a strange way of making an empty house feel even lonelier. But then it kept happening, again and again. Every time I entered, silence followed. Every time I offered an opinion, someone gently reminded me that times have changed. Have you ever experienced that feeling? Sitting in a room surrounded by your own family yet somehow feeling completely invisible. It's one of the loneliest feelings in the world. Then came the little decisions. They painted the living room without asking me. They turned my late wife's sewing room into a home office. Her favorite rocking chair, the one where she'd spent countless hours reading to our son when he was little, was quietly moved into the garage because, according to my daughter-in-law, it made the house look old-fashioned. One afternoon, I found it sitting there, covered in dust. I stood there staring at it for nearly an hour, remembering the woman who had filled that chair with warmth, comfort, and love. I wanted to carry it back inside, but something stopped me. I didn't want another argument. Isn't it strange how easily we convince ourselves to stay quiet just to keep the peace? But peace built on silence isn't really peace at all. It's surrender. Even family dinners changed. They ordered food without asking if I wanted anything. Weekend plans were made without ever mentioning them to me. Sometimes I'd only realize they had gone away after noticing their car was missing from the driveway. The house I'd spent decades paying for slowly stopped feeling like my home. It began to feel as though I was renting a small corner of someone else's life. Yet every night before going to bed, I'd tell myself, tomorrow will be different. Tomorrow my son would remember who taught him to ride a bicycle. Tomorrow he'd remember the nights I stayed awake beside his bed when he was sick. Tomorrow he'd remember the sacrifices his mother and I made so he could go to college without carrying the burden of debt. But tomorrow never came. Then, one evening, everything suddenly began to make sense. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I had simply gone into the hallway to grab an old toolbox from the storage closet. That's when I heard voices drifting from the dining room. My son's voice was calm, almost excited. His wife sounded even more confident. I should have walked away. Maybe I would have slept better if I had. But one sentence froze me where I stood. "Once the house is officially ours," she said, "we can finally do whatever we want." I felt my heart skip a beat. Officially ours. What exactly did she mean by that? I stood there, barely breathing, as the conversation continued. With every word I heard, one terrible realization began to take shape. They weren't just talking about redecorating the house anymore. They were talking about a future that didn't seem to include me. And what shocked me even more was how completely certain they sounded that nothing could stop them. What they didn't know was that they had overlooked one detail so important it was about to unravel every plan they believed was already certain. I stood completely still, barely daring to breathe. Every instinct told me to walk away, to pretend I hadn't heard a single word. But when you're a parent, there's something inside you that refuses to ignore the possibility that your family is falling apart. So I remained there in that quiet hallway, listening to a conversation I was never meant to hear. My daughter-in-law spoke first. "Once everything is finalized, we'll finally have enough space to make this house our own." My son answered without hesitation. "Dad won't fight it. He hates confrontation. He'll understand it's time for us to move forward." Those words hurt far more than I ever expected. Not because they underestimated me, but because they spoke as though I had already become an obstacle standing in the way of their future. It wasn't anger I felt in that moment. It was disappointment, the kind that settles deep in your chest when you realize someone you've loved unconditionally no longer sees you as a person, but as a problem to be solved. Have you ever experienced that feeling? The painful realization that people aren't waiting for you to speak anymore. They're simply waiting for you to step aside. I quietly returned to my room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed where my wife and I had spent countless evenings talking about our dreams. Her photograph rested on the nightstand beside me, and for the first time since losing her, I found myself speaking to it out loud. "What happened to our boy?" I whispered. "Where did we go wrong?" Of course, the photograph couldn't answer, but as I sat there surrounded by memories, I couldn't stop replaying his childhood in my mind. I remembered teaching him how to throw a baseball in the backyard. I remembered working double shifts so he could attend the college he dreamed of. I remembered helping him with the down payment on his first car, because I wanted his life to be easier than mine had ever been. Parents never keep score. We don't give because we expect something in return. We give because that's what love does. But somewhere deep inside, we hope that one day, our children will remember those sacrifices when life tests their character. Somewhere along the way, my son had forgotten. The days that followed became almost unbearable because once you've seen the truth, you can't pretend it isn't there. Suddenly, I noticed everything. They measured rooms with tape measures while discussing renovations they had never mentioned to me. They browsed expensive furniture online, laughing about where everything would go. One evening, I walked into the living room and found brochures from local real estate agents spread across the coffee table. The moment they saw me, they hurriedly gathered them up, smiling awkwardly as though nothing unusual had happened. They assumed I hadn't noticed. I said nothing. Sometimes silence reveals far more than confrontation ever could. The more comfortable they became, the more confident they grew. They started talking openly about future plans right in front of me, convinced I either wasn't paying attention or simply didn't matter anymore. One afternoon, my daughter-in-law smiled and said, "This place is going to look completely different before the holidays." My son smiled too. Neither of them realized I understood exactly what she meant. They believed the future belonged entirely to them. They believed I had nowhere else to go and no choice but to accept whatever they decided. But there was one thing they had never stopped to ask, one simple question that would have changed everything. Who actually owned the house? They believed they already knew the answer, but assumptions built on confidence instead of facts have a way of falling apart. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten. I didn't even mention what I'd overheard. Instead, I quietly walked upstairs, opened an old cedar chest tucked away in the back of my closet, and searched beneath decades of carefully preserved family documents. Insurance papers, tax records, old photographs, letters my wife had written years ago. Then, beneath a worn brown folder tied with a faded ribbon, I found exactly what I had been looking for. My hands trembled as I unfolded the document. One glance was all it took. There it was, exactly as I remembered. And in that moment, I realized something my son and his wife still hadn't discovered. Their biggest mistake wasn't asking me to leave my own home. It was assuming they already knew who had the legal right to stay. But before I made a single move, there was someone I needed to call, because what I was about to learn would determine whether my family could still be saved, or whether it was already too late. I held that document in my hands for what felt like an eternity. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It carried the weight of decades of hard work, sacrifice, and promises made long before my son ever imagined asking me to leave. The edges had yellowed with time, and the ink wasn't as sharp as it once was, but one thing remained perfectly clear. The house was still legally mine. My name, and only my name, was on the deed. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't felt since that painful conversation in the kitchen. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't revenge. It was relief. Quiet, overwhelming relief. Have you ever discovered that the one thing you almost forgot about turned out to be the very thing that saved you? I sat back in my chair, closed my eyes, and thought about the day my wife and I bought that house. We weren't wealthy, not even close. We counted every dollar, skipped vacations, drove old cars until they could barely keep running, and spent years repairing things ourselves, because hiring someone simply wasn't an option. That house wasn't handed to us. It was earned one paycheck at a time. Every wall represented another year of overtime. Every room carried memories of sacrifices that only two young parents trying to build a future could truly understand. I could still hear my wife's voice on the day we signed the papers. She squeezed my hand, smiled, and said, "No matter what happens in life, always make sure we have a place to call home." At the time, I thought she meant financial security. I never imagined those words would become one of the most important pieces of advice she would ever leave me. Years later, after updating our estate plans, my wife and I had spoken with an attorney about protecting each other if one of us passed away first. We discussed different options, different legal arrangements, and every possible situation we could imagine. Neither of us ever thought our own child would one day become part of that conversation, but life has a way of testing the plans we hope we'll never need. For reasons that made perfect sense at the time, we decided the deed would remain exactly as it was. We told ourselves we could always make changes later if circumstances required it. But later never came. My wife's illness changed everything. Our focus shifted from paperwork to hospital visits, medications, and simply making the most of the time we had left together. After she passed away, I couldn't bring myself to open those documents again. The thought of looking through that folder felt like reopening a wound that was still trying to heal. So the papers remained exactly where she had left them, untouched, forgotten, at least by me. Apparently, my son had forgotten about them too, or maybe he had never known about them in the first place. Either way, he had built his entire plan on an assumption instead of a fact, and assumptions have a dangerous way of collapsing when they are finally tested. Still, I wasn't interested in embarrassing him. Despite everything that had happened, he was still my son. A father's heart doesn't stop loving simply because it has been hurt. I kept asking myself if there was still a way to save our relationship before it reached the point of no return. Maybe there had been a misunderstanding. Maybe someone had influenced him. Maybe, if we sat down and talked honestly, we could still find our way back to being a family. But another voice inside me asked a painful question. If someone truly believes you no longer belong in your own home, how much of that can really be blamed on a misunderstanding? I knew emotions alone wouldn't answer that question. I needed facts. I needed to understand exactly where I stood, not just emotionally, but legally. So the next morning, after another sleepless night, I picked up my phone and searched for the number of the attorney who had helped my wife and me all those years ago. I wasn't even sure he was still practicing. My hands trembled slightly as I dialed. Part of me hoped no one would answer because making that call meant accepting that my family had reached a place I never thought possible. The phone rang once, then twice. On the third ring, someone answered. After I introduced myself, there was a brief pause before a familiar voice said my name. He remembered me. We exchanged a few quiet words before I explained why I was calling. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said something that made my heart pound even faster. "Bring every document you have," He told me calmly, "There are a few things you need to know before you make your next move." In that moment, I realized this was no longer just about a family disagreement. It was about protecting the home my wife and I had spent a lifetime building. And what I discovered in that attorney's office would change the course of all our lives. The attorney's office hadn't changed much over the years. The same brick building stood quietly on the corner of a familiar street, and the waiting room still carried that faint scent of old books and polished wood. Walking through those doors felt strangely emotional because the last time my wife and I had been there, we were making plans for a future we believed would always include laughter, grandchildren, and a peaceful retirement. Never once did we imagine that those same documents would one day become my only protection against my own son. As I sat in the waiting room with the worn brown folder resting on my lap, I couldn't stop asking myself one question. How does a family reach a point where a father needs legal advice simply to remain in the home he spent his entire life paying for? It's a question I hope none of you ever have to answer. A few minutes later, the attorney welcomed me into his office. His hair had turned completely gray since we'd last met, but his calm voice hadn't changed at all. He didn't rush me. He simply asked me to tell him everything from the beginning, so I did. I spoke about my wife's passing, the growing distance between my son and me, the strange conversations, the remodeling plans, and the words that still echoed in my mind. "You don't belong in this house anymore." Every sentence felt heavier than the last. Several times, I had to stop just to collect myself. He listened without interrupting, taking only a few notes before reaching for the documents I had brought with me. One by one, he examined each page carefully. Minutes passed in complete silence. I watched his expression, trying to understand what he was thinking, but experienced attorneys rarely reveal anything until they are certain of the facts. Finally, he placed the deed on his desk, looked directly at me, and said, "You were right to come before making any decisions." My heart began to pound. Then he gently tapped the document with his finger. "According to these records, you're the sole legal owner of this property." Even though I already believed that was true, hearing those words spoken aloud felt completely different. It was as if someone had lifted an enormous weight from my shoulders. For weeks, I had been questioning myself, wondering if I had forgotten something important or misunderstood the paperwork. But there it was, clear, simple, undeniable. The house my wife and I had worked so hard to build still legally belonged to me. The attorney continued, explaining that ownership and family expectations are often two very different things. He reminded me that emotions can cloud judgment, especially when property becomes involved. Then he asked a question I wasn't prepared for. "What do you actually want?" At first, I didn't know how to answer. Did I want my son out of the house? No. Did I want revenge? Absolutely not. Did I want to embarrass him or prove him wrong? That wasn't it either. I closed my eyes for a moment before quietly saying, "I just want my son back." The attorney nodded slowly, almost as though he had heard those exact words many times before. "Then don't make your next move out of anger," he said. "Protect your rights, but give yourself the chance to see people's true intentions before deciding what comes next." Those words stayed with me long after I left his office. As I drove home, I realized I had a choice. I could walk through that front door holding those legal papers, confront everyone immediately, and end the argument within minutes. But would that heal anything, or would it simply create wounds that could never be repaired? I decided to wait, not because I was afraid, but because I needed one final answer. I needed to know whether my son would come to his senses on his own or whether he truly intended to force me out. Sometimes people reveal who they really are only when they believe they have already won. So I returned home carrying the same quiet smile I had left with that morning. My son barely looked up from the couch. My daughter-in-law continued browsing furniture catalogs, as though nothing in the world was unusual. Neither of them asked where I had been. Neither of them seemed curious. They were far too confident. Over the next few days, that confidence only grew. I overheard discussions about repainting bedrooms, replacing family photographs, and even converting my late wife's garden into a parking space for a second car. Every conversation confirmed the same thing. They believed my departure was only a matter of time. Then, late one evening, I walked past the dining room and heard my son say something that made me stop in my tracks. "Let's tell him this weekend," he said quietly. "It's better if we just get it over with." His wife replied without hesitation. "He'll be upset at first, but he'll have no choice." I stood there in complete silence. No choice. Those two words echoed through my mind all night long. They had already planned the conversation. They had already decided my future. What they didn't realize was that my future was about to be decided by something neither of them had bothered to verify. And when Saturday morning finally arrived, they gathered around the kitchen table, believing they were about to give me the biggest shock of my life. In reality, they were about to receive one themselves. Saturday morning arrived with an unusual calm, the kind of calm that often comes just before everything changes. I woke up earlier than usual, made myself a cup of coffee, and sat on the back porch watching the sunrise over the yard where my son had once chased fireflies on warm summer evenings. It was strange how peaceful everything looked. Birds still sang, the trees still swayed gently in the breeze. The house stood exactly as it always had, yet inside those walls, a family was about to face a truth none of us could ever take back. Have you ever noticed how life can appear perfectly normal on the outside while everything underneath is about to fall apart? I finished my coffee, took a slow breath, and walked back inside. My son and his wife were already sitting at the kitchen table. They looked nervous, but not uncertain. There was confidence in their faces, the confidence of people who believed they already knew how this story would end. My son motioned for me to sit down. "Dad," he began, avoiding my eyes for a moment. "We need to have an important conversation." I nodded quietly and took my seat. He cleared his throat before continuing. "We've been talking about what's best for everyone, and we've decided it's time for you to find another place to live." The words were spoken politely, but they landed just as hard as they had the first time. His wife leaned forward and added, "This house isn't really practical anymore. We need the space, and we think an assisted living community, or a smaller apartment would be better for you." Better for me. Funny how people sometimes disguise their own wishes as concern for someone else. I looked at both of them for several seconds without saying a word. The silence seemed to make them uncomfortable. My son finally spoke again. "Dad, please don't make this harder than it has to be. We'll help you pack. We'll even cover your moving expenses." Help me pack. As though 40 years of memories could be folded into cardboard boxes over a single weekend. As though the home where my wife took her last breath was nothing more than another address. I felt sadness, yes, but strangely, I didn't feel anger anymore. The attorney had been right. Clarity changes everything. Instead of arguing, I simply asked one question. "Can I ask you both something?" They nodded. "Before making this decision, did either of you ever check who actually owns this house?" They exchanged confused looks. My daughter-in-law answered first. "Well, after Mom passed away, we just assumed everything naturally became part of the family." Assumed. There was that word again. My son shrugged slightly. "Does it really matter? Eventually, it was always going to be ours anyway." I looked at him carefully. There was no cruelty in his voice now, only certainty built on a misunderstanding. I slowly stood up and walked to the hallway closet, where I'd placed the brown folder the night before. Every step felt deliberate. Neither of them spoke as I returned to the table. I placed the folder gently between us, and slid a single document toward my son. "Read it," I said softly. He frowned, unfolding the paper with little concern at first. But I watched his expression change almost immediately. His confidence faded. His eyes moved across the page once, then again. He looked at the signature, then at the property description, then back to the name printed in bold letters. Mine. The color drained from his face. His wife leaned over his shoulder, reading the same document. A few seconds later, she looked at me, with an expression I had never seen before. Not anger, not sadness, but complete disbelief. The room became so quiet that I could hear the ticking of the old clock hanging above the stove. Finally, my son whispered, I didn't know." I nodded. "I know you didn't." Another long silence followed. He looked down at the document again before asking, almost to himself, "So the house is still yours?" "Yes," I answered calmly. "It always has been." Suddenly, everything they had planned collapsed in front of them. The conversations about renovations, the assumptions about ownership, the confidence that I had no choice. It had all been built on one mistake they never bothered to verify. My daughter-in-law leaned back in her chair without saying a word. My son rubbed his forehead, staring at the table as though he were trying to wake up from a bad dream. For the first time since this began, they weren't looking at me as someone they could push aside. They were looking at me as the man whose quiet patience had just shattered every assumption they had made. But what happened next surprised me even more than the document itself. My son slowly lifted his head, looked me directly in the eyes, and said 5 words I never expected to hear. "Dad, can you forgive me?" I wish I could tell you those words fixed everything instantly. I wish healing were that simple. But forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. One can be offered in a moment, the other must be earned over time. And before I answered him, there was one final decision I needed to make, a decision that would determine not only who stayed in that house, but whether our family still had any chance of becoming a family again. My son's question lingered in the air. "Dad, can you forgive me?" I looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for something I hadn't seen in weeks. Was it regret? Was it fear? Or was it simply the realization that his plan had fallen apart? Sometimes, it's difficult to tell the difference. And maybe some of you have faced moments like that in your own lives, when someone apologizes only after being confronted with the truth. It's natural to wonder whether they're truly sorry for what they did or simply sorry that they got caught. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I folded my hands on the table and quietly said, "Forgiveness isn't the hardest part, son. The hardest part is rebuilding trust after someone has shown you exactly where you stand in their life." He lowered his eyes. There was nothing left for him to argue. The document lying between us had ended every debate, but it hadn't healed a single wound. That was something no piece of paper could ever do. We sat there in silence, each of us trapped in our own thoughts. Finally, I broke it. "Do you know what hurt me the most?" I asked. "It wasn't that you wanted the house. It wasn't even that you thought about asking me to leave. It was that you made those decisions without ever talking to me. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being your father and became a problem you wanted to solve." My son's shoulders dropped. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I never looked at it that way." "I know," I replied gently. "That's exactly why we're sitting here today." His wife finally spoke, her confidence completely gone. "We honestly thought we were planning for the future. We convinced ourselves it was practical. We never stopped to think about how it would feel for you." I nodded slowly. "That's the danger of seeing people as obstacles instead of family. Once you stop seeing their heart, every decision becomes easier, even the wrong ones." The room fell silent again.